Introduce our panelists today, and I'm going to allow them to give a more thorough introduction of themselves and their work in presentations to start. But first we have Mercedes Bidart, and she is the co-founder and CEO of Quipu, which is revolutionizing marketplaces in Argentina. Next we have Karen Brandt. She is the founder and CEO of Co-Urbanize, which is changing the way in which planners engage communities. And finally, we have William Gilchrist, who is the director of planning for the city of Oakland and deeply engaged in the question of how do we bring communities out of the COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you so much for our panelists for joining us today. And I'm going to turn it first to Mercedes for a further introduction and presentation of her work.
Hi, thanks Janelle, thanks Swafa for the invitation, and I am very glad of being part of this panel. As you were saying, I'm from Argentina, but I'm based in Colombia, in the Caribbean coast, in a city called Barranquilla. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Quipu Market, which is a community marketplace that enables trade without money while building credit worthiness. We work in the spaces of our cities, in our cities where informality is concentrated, not just informal housing, but also economic informality, right? So we create a platform where people that live in these cities, in these parts of our cities, can visualize what they create, what they produce, or what they offer, can transact with one another, and prioritize buying locally rather than buying in other places, maybe in the formal city, right? And at the same time, while using Quipu, they start creating a credit worthiness, a great history they didn't have before. So basically, that's what we are creating here. We launched in the middle of COVID times. We launched last year in July. So I have a lot to share on how it was to work with tech and communities. And not just focusing on actually civic engagement, but we think that there's no civic engagement if there's no economic engagement. And that's what we are trying to create with a tool as Quipu. So I will just share briefly a very brief. Okay, just a second. You can see the type of communities that I'm talking about. This is called, they are called.
We don't see your slides.
You don't see a screen? Okay. There's always tech problems with tech people. Okay, let me see. Okay, yeah. It's just for the audience to, imagine what I'm talking about. These cities in these places of our cities in Latin America are, one in every 4 people in cities live in these kind of neighborhoods that we call slums, informal settlements, public housing neighborhoods. So I'll put it again so you can see the beginning of the video. But it's basically, as I was saying, these spaces of concentrated informality. And I think that informality is actually a topic that in these COVID solutions was there, like people are recognizing it as a problem, but the solutions are not still at the same level as the problem we need to face. So thank you for the invitation, and I'm very pumped to be here talking with you all.
Thank you so much, Mercedes. Karen, would you like to share your presentation?
Sure. I'm just going to go ahead and pull up my slides here. Great. Can you confirm that they're up?
Yes, that looks good.
Okay, great. Well, what I'd like to do today is take stock of where we're at and examine this question: are we at a tipping point for transparency and accountability? My name is Karen Brandt. I'm the CEO and founder at Co-Urbanize. After getting my MCP here at MIT, my enthusiasm for change faced the reality of how cities and individual buildings are designed, approved, and built. So I created Co-Urbanize to make the process more equitable and efficient. Co-Urbanize is a technology company. Our engagement platform, pictured here, and our services really give people a way to share their feedback without having to go to a public meeting and in their own preferred language by posting a comment online, texting their feedback, or leaving comments by voicemail. And we've worked with nearly 500 projects across the US and Canada, so we have a really unique visibility into community engagement dynamics across different cities and at multiple scales. We've worked with large firms like Silverstein in New York or Boston Properties, institutions like MIT, Ford Motor Company, a lot of affordable housing teams from the national scale Mercy Housing to local CDCs, and municipalities as big as places like Detroit or Dodge City, Kansas. So in reflecting on what we've seen, there are really three key themes that get to this question of what are the conditions under which a tipping point can occur. And the first is redefining inclusivity. In the last 13 months, we've seen a reckoning. About a year ago, we started getting a lot of calls from real estate teams saying, we can't have in-person meetings, so how can we be inclusive? So two things. First, the idea that real estate teams wanted to be inclusive was a breath of fresh air. Our not so secret mission at Co-Urbanize is how do we help real estate teams who innately hold their cards close to the vest actually be more like planners, share information proactively, engage community members early and often. So that was a breath of fresh air. But second, it really begged the question, was the in-person meeting actually inclusive? And I always like to look at this data from some professors at Boston University who've done really interesting work to find data that really shows most people don't go to community meetings. 95% of the people who do show up are whiter, richer, and older than the community members that they represent. And overwhelmingly, this group of participants is likely to oppose housing change. So there's a lot of people that don't go to community meetings. Just to name a few: single parents, people who work multiple jobs, non-native English speakers. There's a lot of people who don't go to community meetings. And so at Co-Urbanize, everything we do is about lowering the barrier to participation. Something I've said a lot in the past year is what's old is new again. The reality is things like mail, letters, postcards, signs, newspaper postings, text messages. These are all really, really effective channels that I think will remain, that have dramatically opened up opportunities for participation in a good way. The second theme is related to that. It's bringing more people into the process. To have a tipping point, we have to see a transformation where, like in any social movement, more people are coming into the fold. One example I want to share is with Molly Eckert, who's another MIT City Planning alum working at POA. She is leading the redevelopment of 2 vacant city-owned lots into an affordable housing community with neighborhood serving retail in Chicago. And before she kicked off this process, one of the really successful approaches she did was postcards and door hangers, informing people about the project and inviting them to go online, share comments by voicemail, text message during the pandemic. And this just dramatically increased the participation at the onset of engagement, and it started to establish trust with the community to kick off a smooth process. Another example of bringing more people into the fold, one that I love, is with Detroit. They were doing the city's first sustainability plan. We know Detroit is enormously large geographically. You can fit Boston, Manhattan, and San Francisco all in its city limits. And what the team wanted to do is expand the participants beyond those who are already participating actively in neighborhood groups. And so what they did was they combined a lot of Co-Urbanize's text messaging capabilities in multiple languages with streets teams, live polling at meetings, and lots of really creative and innovative ways to reach more people. One of the third things that I've seen is really the crux of it. It's accountability. It's actually changing the dialogue. It's having accountability for the outcomes in this process. And what we've seen looking at tons of comments across the country from what people share on Co-Urbanize is that in addition to the steady stream of requests for a neighborhood Trader Joe's, people are also very vocal that developers would include minority-owned businesses, support for BIPOC businesses, and lots of accessibility, and really rethinking how a project can impact the neighborhood in a more equitable way. And so going back to the question, are we at a tipping point? I think there are signs of momentum in some communities, which is really exciting. But however, for a real tipping point where we don't go back, there are a lot of obstacles. And two concerns in particular that I see. One, it's just so easy to slip back into complacency unless a new group of people come in to the fold and push for accountability. And what that looks like is that they need to hear a developer respond to them and actually see it happen. Otherwise, they'll become disengaged. And the second, and I'd love to hear from Mercedes and William how this compares to what they see on the ground in their communities, is that even before this all began, planners already had an enormous amount of work and problems on their plate. Now they have an economic crisis, they're scrambling to compete for new infrastructure investment dollars, and on top of that, we're asking them to be high-tech meeting facilitators, multi-channel marketers, and website developers. It's really hard. Ultimately, change is not easy, and it's going to require a continual concerted effort. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Janelle.
Thank you so much, Karen. That's absolutely terrific. I want to introduce our final panelist, William. Are you able to turn on your video? There we go.
I believe so. I think you may be seeing me now in my office in Oakland, California. And good day to the group. Fantastic presentations and content so far. And what I'd like to do is frame from the perspective of a public servant in planning and development some of the issues that we've been discussing, and perhaps pose the perspective that much of what we're talking about is not new in terms of engagement and inclusion and how we collectively determine the future of our cities and our habitation, but that we are really experiencing one among a series, a locus of points of engagement, transformation, and hopefully revelation in how we can bring our work forward more responsibly for the communities that we serve. By means of just a very quick biography, I am an alumnus of MIT, both of the architecture program and of the Sloan Business School. And of course, I took that combination and have made a career in public sector. But I also wanted to note that during my time in the architecture department at MIT, the curriculum was very integrated with the planning school as well. You had as part of your requirement for graduation, both undergraduate and grad programs, to take joint courses between 4 and 11. And they culminated really in environmental design studios, where the concerns of planning, of community, of urban design, and architecture were really brought together in a way that I don't think many institutions across the nation were doing at that time. And I was certainly engaged by the presentation of our main speaker from Carnegie Mellon. And I've had the opportunity and the honor to serve on the Remaking Cities Institute board of that university for many, many years. And I know they also have engaged in a similar multidisciplinary understanding with a great tradition of work like David Lewis, Don Carter, members of that faculty. But what I'd like to do by means of the prism of looking at how we engage community in our work is to bring forward some projects and assignments that I've had over my career. And want to know, can you all see my slides, or do I need to hit the share? Are they visible?
Hit the share screen, William, at the bottom.
Will do. Of course, that was a low-tech option. There we go. All right, and I will open this up. All right, can you see the Olmsted plan
Yes.
for the city of Birmingham? All right, excellent. So my first foray into public sector work was when I moved to Birmingham, Alabama, actually to be on point for the development of the Civil Rights Museum and District. And then was engaged by the planning department there by a gentleman named Mike Dobbins, who ran that department. He had come out of Yale and also had worked in John Lindsay's administration with Jonathan Barnett, and had established the Urban Design Group in New York. And they really took a holistic perspective around engagement of community along the conversations of how cities would be built at a neighborhood and community level. And when I went to Birmingham, Alabama, and Mike actually came out to Berkeley, left the position, the mayor at the time, Richard Arrington, appointed me to the position of planning and engineering director. And one of the projects that we had was really a legacy project from the 1925 Olmsted Park Plan for the city of Birmingham. It's done in order primarily to link communities and also to address floodplain management in the watershed. But one of the issues facing this implementation moving forward was the fact that we were also looking at the time at one of the most segregated cities in America. And the concept of having a linear system of parks that would engage communities across race and class was something that did not gain the political traction that it would need to be implemented, while it clearly addressed issues topographically in terms of floodplain management and also providing recreational opportunities for the community writ large. So in 1926, following the Euclid decision around zoning, the city actually adopted its first citywide zoning overlay. And one of the categories, overlay categories in the zoning, was a race-based separation. Now, Birmingham was not the only city in the nation to do this. Baltimore actually was the first one to implement a program of this nature, but Birmingham certainly had one of the most rigidly defined codes that determined where Blacks and where whites could actually live based on the zoning ordinance. And one of the major distributions, primary distributions for Black residencies was along the floodplain, along with industrial land uses. So needless to say, the following decades, particularly with repeated flood incidents, became a major issue of environmental justice. And one could also argue, and again, this is one of the reasons why I think we are looking at a tipping point, but it is not unique in terms of the points of inflection where we've had to engage our work. One of the reasons that Birmingham, I think, became a focus, much of the civil rights movement and the tactic deliberately of using a place-based strategy of organizing marches and moving into places where one had been restricted, was because of this historic nature of how planning had been used as an instrument of segregation within that community. So when the national movements arose, Birmingham became almost a natural focal point to demonstrate, to bring forth to the fore these issues. And as part of its acknowledgement of this history, there's been much celebration on the civil rights struggle through the Institute, through Kelly Ingram Park. The city has embraced much of this history and the transformational impact it had across the nation. And as the city transitioned from its industrial base into more of a service-based economy, this being University of Alabama, Birmingham Major Medical Center, also research and innovation hub, the engagement around the city, how it actually looked at its future opportunities around neighborhood processes came to fore. And in response to the adoption of the CDBG program in the late 70s, Birmingham adopted what has largely been recognized as one of the most pervasive and effective neighborhood participation programs in the nation, where the system was originally confected that neighborhoods that were census tracked to receive CDBG funds would have neighborhood organizations. The city at large, irrespective of demography or income, made a determination that every square inch of the city, irrespective of race or class, would have a neighborhood association established. So for decades now, every process related to land use consideration, to capital program, to street signs, goes through a neighborhood participation review before it comes before the Planning Commission or Historic Commission or City Council for an action. So part of the framework that was established, very strong bones in this city in terms of having an organization and a culture where neighborhood engagement was part of the process. And of course, this is not the same scenario in every city across the nation, but there are always opportunities to be instructed and to learn from cities that have in fact engaged these processes. Honolulu has a very strong system as well. There are cities across the nation from which we can learn where the inheritance and the legacy of engagement has been effective around the work that we perform. And in moving forward, particularly with these virtual forms that have been adopted in response to our physical isolation, we should be looking at these cities for those opportunities. And just moving very quickly through the whole place-based consideration around segregation of open spaces, through this neighborhood association and the opportunity to engage all demographic interests in the city for the determination of how we could reuse a major brownfield downtown, we were able to ensure that programmatically, through the design and through the conceptualization of what this open space would be, both as a fulcrum for downtown and for a connection to the rest of the green network within the region, that all the communities were represented who needed to participate in the confection of what this space would be. So we had Urban Design Associates, another great Pittsburgh-based firm with Carnegie Mellon Association, involved as our consultants to help visualize from the urban design perspective and development perspective what this space could be, and in fact realized it later through the great work of Tom Leader's studio and our own Sheila Kennedy from the faculty of MIT from the architecture department, who confected a space that more than any historically in that city was used and is seen as an amenity across all sectors of neighborhoods and of demography. But again, that was through the groundwork that was laid by the community engagement processes. And then very quickly, just showing again different design features and uses of this space and ongoing conversations incrementally as to how this can be built on. So again, the idea that we are at a crossroads around conditions or situations or our need for stretching and including communities, BIPOC communities, communities of historic interest, the influx of new citizens and residents who come in to our communities is not new. One of the things that we also have to be mindful of as we look at outreach is that we define community in its broad sense of what effectively needs to congeal in order for us both to visualize places that we need to create and to implement them in ways that are true to that vision. So it is the neighborhood engagement, absolutely. It is also making sure that there's an alignment around political leadership and other support mechanisms through commerce, through business, through institutions, through foundations, that we look at the team of community and as broad a definition as possible. And then very quickly going through work in New Orleans, looking at a major tipping point post-Katrina. When I came into Ms. Lander's administration in 2010, we were still doing much revisioning and rebuilding of that community that was going through a major tipping point in response to the major disaster that had occurred. And there had been several iterations and attempts at plans to bring the city back online. We had major immigration coming in from across the country, many people wanting to help and then not wanting to leave. So we had the transformation also demographically of a city that had some of the oldest generational lineage of families in place of any city in America, receiving an influx of people from outside of that city there to stay at a historic level that had never been seen before. So the whole conversation about who made community, how it was going to be envisioned around bringing New Orleans back, took on a whole different parameter from earlier planning initiatives in the past. And again, there was an introduction of new responsive architecture that was looking at new technologies, new place-based generation, looking at leveraging public facilities for community in response to their needs. How does a school be more than a school in a neighborhood, in a community? And also, how do we bring communities back that's also deferential and respectful of the traditions? But engagement was absolutely critical to that process. And again, this is a value that we have to bring forward through our post-pandemic conversations as well, using not just the technological innovations we have, but thinking post-pandemic that there may be some combination, or probably will be some combination, of all these modes of community engagement we've had historically. Nothing will ever take the place of getting everybody in the room to charrette over a piece of paper and really work things out for what they'd like to see their communities become. But also there have been some advantages through the virtual forum as well, to be able to reach out to participants who might not otherwise have been able to make it to these physical settings. So we may be looking at some sort of amalgam or combination of both of these approaches. And again, always being mindful that whether it is virtual or whether we're doing the meeting within a town hall or community center, we're talking about real places and real spaces that have real impacts to the communities that we're discussing. And then just as an example, again, the infrastructure conversation we're having, looking at where we're going to be receiving resources and the agendas that are being set in Washington, D.C., at our state capitals, and most importantly, at our communities and city councils. How are we going to engage in looking at issues of past remediation? This is the Claiborne Corridor, which was one of the projects that was lifted in President Biden's infrastructure presentation several weeks back, one of the featured projects in New Orleans, where an interstate came through the traditional African-American communities of Tremaine, 7th Ward, Mid-City, Broadmoor, several communities of color affected by an interstate that came in, and then engaging community in ways that they can vision either how to live with or how to remove this infrastructure, but there's going to be much pent-up demand to engage these discussions now that this has become a priority coming out of Washington as well. So we have multiple layers of engagement and discussion where the urgency is going to have to really look at ways we leverage the resources we have around forums and processes, and also the outcomes we have to address our communities, both to right what have been historic wrongs, but also to provide opportunity that we have in front of us that we must engage. So I think that's plenty for now, and we can get into our round robin conversation. I think where we can also identify many other aspects synergistic to move forward with our opportunities for engagement post-pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, William, for that terrific presentation. Maybe what I could do is ask each of the panelists to turn on your cameras. Terrific. And I want to start with a question for you. I think this has been really insightful with Molly's presentation about the new normal post-COVID and what does that mean for our social interactions. And then each of your work, which is really inspiring about engaging and bringing communities together. As you know, post-pandemic, we are at a kind of critical tipping point. And for me, it really brings up the challenge of climate change. I think that's one of the things that we're facing as we think about our urban spaces and also urban-rural relationships. As we come out of the pandemic, the next great challenge is thinking about adaptation and resilience as communities are increasingly feeling the impacts of climate change from increasingly adverse storm events, heat events in cities, fires, flood, and sea level rise. And as you mentioned, William, the Biden administration is trying to respond to this with a massive infrastructure plan that thinks about decarbonizing critical infrastructure across the country, but more critically thinks about how to do that in a just manner by bridging questions of social infrastructure, economic infrastructure, and even environmental infrastructure. And so the first question I want to pose for all of you is, what does that mean in the context of your work and your experience? What is a just transition that keeps transparency and accountability in the core in urban design, planning, and governance? And maybe we'll start with Mercedes again.
Okay. Yeah, well, so I didn't want to start because actually I will speak from the South, and we are not governed by Biden, so it's really different what we are living here. So maybe I can say what I see from how this just transition could look like here, and what I'm seeing actually it's very hopeless. I mean, there's no transition at this point, and there's no space for transition at this point in the communities where I work and in the cities with which I work in Latin America. We are still living the pandemic in the worst moment ever, worse than last year, because this year there's no money. So the economic crisis is really hitting the communities where we work. So what I see is actually problems that are ancient, that are problems of obviously civic engagement, of public space design, of climate change, and of economic development that are really old problems. And these were emergencies before this emergency of the pandemic. They were urgent, but they were not looking at them. We were just saying, okay, this informal city, which is literally 1/4 of the city, we are not looking at it. There's no policy around it. And when the pandemic hit it, this was, most of local governments, they were calling us just saying, like, what do we do with informality? Like, we really don't know. Like, what do you suggest? Like, they were starting to think about policy around the topic. So what I see is actually, at least in Latin America, the pandemic this is a space and a moment where these type of problems are seen and are relevant, are on the agenda. But the transition would be great if we start thinking beyond the policy that we have at hand. So most of local governments, they just stayed at the cash transfer solution, you know, and that was it. And that's and that money, they don't have traction of what happened, like what happened with that money, where it was invested. That money actually helped to develop the communities in the city, or it was actually, you know, just something that helped in a really short term. So what I'm seeing is actually a space and a moment where we could have a transition here too, for sure. But we need to start thinking beyond the normal, typical policy that was designed before the pandemic. So we really should start like using tools that could, you know, reshape the way the economy is designed, and mostly from the bottom up. So that's the situation I'm seeing here as, and I don't think we are at the point of thinking of a post-pandemic city. We are still thinking of the emergency, but it would be great if with the funds they are dedicating for the emergency, we could start doing that transition. So well, as always, we always look at the North too, you know, to learn from there, and the North also from the South. So I'm also eager to listen to my colleagues.
Thank you, Mercedes. Terrific. Karen?
Yeah, in terms of a just transition, I think one of the most important things is the decisions of prioritizing where that investment is needed. Is it about who can organize and submit the best proposal, or is it about where the greatest need is? And I think the question is the investment happening just about the actual infrastructure itself, or is the investment actually about the organizing and the planning of how the investment should be used in a specific area? And I think William actually has one of the best examples I've ever heard related to his work in New Orleans around this particular topic.
William?
Okay, sure. I will jump in. No, it's a great question, and I'll go back again to models actually back from Birmingham with the neighborhood engagement. One of the opportunities we always have with these points of inflection, all right, these transformational moments, is to really dig deep in the way we've always done things and question them. How can we do things differently? I would certainly argue that most cities should use this moment to see on the engagement framework, how can we, so the best word I can use for the moment, institutionalize neighborhood and community participation. So to the extent that where there is no formal network, even an informal network will work. And often you want a combination of both, because you need to get into the community, not that they're going to show up at your meeting. I think Karen also raised that point, but you also have got to get to where community meets anyway. We have to find ways to be able to get before their forums, to be welcomed in to their spaces in order to talk about aspirations, situations, and conditions. And then how those can be addressed and move forward. And I also think we have to question our analytics. What are the tools that we typically have used in the past to make the kind of investment determinations that Karen is referring to? As an example, I'll go up the road a little bit from MIT to that other school, where Michael Porter has done some remarkable work around intercity competitiveness, the ICIC group, and looking at models that can identify what we traditionally may call a gray economy that's sort of outside of your more classical modeling for urban economics. But what are the unmet demands of those communities, and where might there be some possibilities for small businesses, for community district businesses to be able to engage or invest to meet some of those demands? How do you tie into other anchor employers within the city writ large and be able to perhaps provide supply support for them as smaller businesses within neighborhoods and communities? But we really have to examine what has been perhaps our standard way of doing analysis around economic opportunity and see what those new opportunities really are. And bring tools to bear that help us get to the opportunities for equity and inclusion across our communities and our neighborhoods. And again, in the work in New Orleans, we really did have to dig deep. There were some organizations in place for community outreach, but so much had been scattered coming out from Katrina that we really had to spend much more time at the front end than is typically spent in community engagement before we even define the problem. And one of the things I would also suggest is that we stop looking at neighborhood engagement as an opportunistic exercise around a particular project or program or funding initiative, but that we establish an ongoing communication, even if it's just to discuss what the next social event's going to be in a neighborhood, that we are somehow tethered in the ongoing discussions in our neighborhoods and our communities. And Karen, if there was one other particular project that you had in mind that I had mentioned, remind me.
I think what struck me is the work post-Katrina, where people were actually feeling threatened by the interventions and saying, no, we don't want this to happen because we think it's actually going to harm us.
No, that's right. Let me run that very quickly. Thank you. And that is on the interstate. But for the longest time, and again, this is the project that one of the projects that Biden featured in his infrastructure rollout, there was a sense from the 1960s and 70s that the interstate had been a grand violation, which it really was in the African-American communities of Treme, 7th Ward, Broadmoor, Mid-City. And this initiative that we took under Obama's administration through the Sustainable Communities Grant, with HUD and DOT working together with us, was to see through an alternatives analysis how we might remove it. Among one of the options, the removal of the interstate was one of the prominent ones we analyzed. But the community itself, which had for at least a generation complained about the violation from this interstate, began to get concerned that the only reason this focus was occurring was that there was this great interest of people moving into New Orleans and that it was going to turnkey gentrification. That now we're talking about this interstate coming down, but for whose benefit now? Is it for the benefit of the communities that have been there generationally? Or are we trying to raise the market opportunities or price points for these neighborhoods by removal of this interstate because there's a sense of a market there that's been unmet? And how we walk that rope of equity and inclusion around whatever transformation that community might unfold. And as a result, there were many advocates, and many people became advocates for the retention of the interstate, but its adaptation around some other use that might benefit the community greater, which is why you saw some of those scenarios where we actually were building places underneath the interstate. So again, that is a sensitivity dialogue that has to happen as well as we move forward with these initiatives.
Thank you, William. That is a terrific example. Something that each of you has spoken to is the importance of place. And I think it's also something Molly addressed in her lecture, the strange way in which the pandemic and the lockdown and being in this virtual reality has transformed our sense of both time and of place. In thinking about the economic transitions, how do we think about the scale of engagement and maintaining the place connection that is so critical to community engagement and community work? And how have each of you addressed that in your own work? Mercedes, maybe we could start with you again, because I think yours is really a terrific example of place embedded in our intervention.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, I think our focus and our perspective on how we approach the problem of economic development in informality is place-based. Yes, like my team and I, we are urbanists. We went to MIT. We did our master's in city planning, and we couldn't think of the problem, detached from where it's happening. So that's why we identified the slums or the informal settlements as those places where economic crisis and the space were like happening the same in a space, and there's where we saw that literally there's tons of opportunities and commerce and another way of practicing, commerce and interaction between people. So I think that when we think about solutions and when we think about engagement, it needs to be local, and it needs to be, I would say, hyper local. And what we were seeing is that maybe these slum dealers, they were they participated in some kind of instance to even or design, if it was like a slum upgrading or some kind of those kind of projects, they were part of some kind of consultation or participation, or there are like different type of social programs on the ground, like maybe run by the government or run by foundations. but there's no much around the economy of those places, and how they could like understand their own economy by mapping, you know, who's there, who's selling what, how we could have a better local economic supply chain. And with the pandemic, that was very relevant. It was kind of like, we cannot move, like we need to stay at home, and I need to see who sells what, and if it's closer to my home, that's better, because I literally can't move. So the hyper local approach was more relevant than before. And what we are seeing is that technology was not reaching these places at all. Like there's no digital platform reaching the economy of the informal city. Policy was not reaching these places, and this was like really you know, visualized this year, I think. So what I'm not seeing, and I would love to see, is actually government and other institutions, you know, not just doing, not just deciding policy from their offices, but actually having spaces of, okay, how is the pandemic you know, situation hurting your family, hurting your community. So our approach is not from the public sector, it's from the private sector, but it's providing a tool that can at least connect the community with one another, and at least, you know, visualize and map who is there offering what, and how we can create that network. And by creating that network, if it's like economic or civic or, you know, whatever excuse you want to give to a network, it's actually a way of getting to know each other and starting to think together on how we can transform our own economy. So I would say that yes, these hyper local, I would say that the you know, the scope needs to be very local and neighborhood based, rather than thinking on, you know, participation in a more broader way.
Wonderful, thank you. Karen?
In terms of how the importance of place has impacted our work, I think we've shifted to helping the real estate and planning teams that we work with in two important ways. The first is the ways that they connect with community members. Because of the pandemic, people were really on lockdown, and everything shifted to more of a 15-minute radius, hyper local. So people were much more connected to their main street, which was really exciting. And it opened up more opportunities for how to reach people in digital ways with, you know, the local newspaper, but also physical ways with some of those text message signs that I showed earlier. So having text message signs in some of the park areas or the areas where people do pass by outside, that they could text in their ideas and feedback in their own language was a lot more effective. And then the second thing was taking stock. We helped teams ask questions to their community of what has changed, how are you being impacted, what do you need? One example that comes to mind is working with the wind companies that is redeveloping a large scale affordable housing residence. They asked, like, what types of job support do you need, health support, to make sure that they were providing more of the right social services and amenities, like food, access to food. Those were really important and really needed, and they were able to quickly do that. The second way that we've been helping with teams, I think, is influencing some of these opportunities, where it's the access to resources given the pandemic and the crisis, but also some of the prime time amenities, open space, retail in your local neighborhood became even more important. And I think also people have said, because of the importance and the economic crisis, that they want to make sure that they are protected, that they are helping businesses that have been impacted, that they're helping BIPOC individuals and owners. So that's been something really exciting to see in terms of both the retail and how people have reimagined how they're going to use open space and make sure it's accessible to the entire community.
Thank you. William?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with everything that's been said by our colleagues. And by the nature of my work as a public official over planning or development or engineering within a city, by definition, it's place-based to a locale. And we've discussed, I think already in some of the other responses, around the urban design and physical characteristics of what we do to be sensitive, both around the nature, the physical nature of the communities we're engaging, what also is considered special, or perhaps in some fashion even sacred by a neighborhood in terms of a place or a space, what significance it has to help the community in its own definition. That there may be events that have occurred, or ceremonies that occur, or some particular landmark in terms of its historical significance. And as we come into these communities, that there's a respect for that. Again, I would go right back to the Claiborne Corridor as an example, that at a larger scale, that kind of deference or consideration was not in place when the selection of the route for that highway came into play. But I also want to pick up on a point I heard Mercedes make earlier around the focus of locality. And I agree with that 100%, but I do think we're moving into a time out of necessity where we have to think both locally and regionally and perhaps globally. And I think around the discussion of climate change and the impacts of climate change in particular, and along any of the coastal cities that we inhabit, and even with the weather patterns affecting the Great Plains or the central areas of continents across the world, that how we look at economic development, the kinds of economies that we're looking at, the kind of consumptive patterns that we're looking at, obviously they are being challenged and called into question around their impact writ large on the environment. You know, whether we're talking about air quality around carbon-based emissions, or they're talking about islands of plastic in the Pacific Ocean, that there is there's a relationship that cannot be separated between these decisions that we make around how we develop locally and economically, and what those patterns are that ripple through other impacts, other sort of non-monetized byproducts of the manufacturing process, or of our waste or non-reusable reuse of materials. And without getting overly romantic about it, I think there's a lot for us to learn historically also from alternate economies, alternate paths of how communities have been able to work and sustain themselves. And again, the emphasis on local is absolutely, I think, the place to start, where Mercedes was making her point earlier. But again, this is all interwoven. And we're also counting to a certain extent on the inelasticity, or the elasticity rather, of the economy, the economic models we had pre-COVID, about how tractable, how malleable they're going to be on the other side of what we find, when we get back out there. What's really going to be interesting, I think, is going to have a symposium like this, maybe 2 years or 3 years, barring any other major global incident, to see how far the pendulum did swing back to what felt like business as usual before COVID. So all of these grand opportunities we may be framing now, how many of them really did translate into a change of the way we do business as usual? So I think we are having to respond locally. That's what we also found in New Orleans post-Katrina. But how true and how clear and continuous our new paths are, we will have to see.
All right. Thank you so much, William. I think we're almost out of time. Do we have time for one more quick lightning question, maybe? Okay. Yeah, so one other dimension that I think is really interesting is this notion of time. In 1 minute, we'll all move on to the next meeting and have a sense that our pace of activity is accelerated, is the significance of place becomes diminished in a virtual reality. And even for the large transitions, I think we have a similar phenomenon of the crisis of urgency creates a sense that we should do things quickly. But accountability and transparency are not necessarily rapid processes. And so my question to all of you is, how do we slow down? I work with Indigenous communities, and I find that as I engage with these communities, planning is normally, the scope of planning is a month or a couple months or a year at most. And as I engage these communities, we start talking across decades. So how do we think long-term? How do we think slowly and deliberatively in 20 seconds each? We'll start with maybe with William and then work our way back around.
Okay, I would say that's a great way you teed it up. I would say we have to start thinking differently about the temporal aspects of planning as an exercise. So I'll just say as an example, we're about to undertake our general plan in Oakland. This was to have a 20-year horizon. But when we're done in a few years with that plan, that's not the last time we look at it. We have to have a mechanism in ongoing, continuous time to re-examine the premises we make around our work and see how we can fine tune and adapt it to the realities that unfold, things we can't predict. So I think rather than saying, okay, this is a 2-year plan and we're done, we understand we have started a process that has a formal adoption maybe in 2 years, but it has to be tended and managed on and on. So that's how
Thank you, William. Karen?
I think it goes back to something else William said earlier about having just an ongoing infrastructure for engagement and participation. Right now, the way it's set up, for example, with real estate entitlements, it feels like all of a sudden you've got to turn on battle mode because it's one project and everything's on the line, and then you move to the next one. It's so siloed that I think if you step back and you had an ongoing process where it created more of a norm, that issue of the time would be less urgent and more focused on long-term planning.
Wonderful. Mercedes?
Yes, I agree with you 100%, Janelle. Like, this is exactly the problem of the pace of the communities I work with. They're not necessarily indigenous, but it's kind of similar, the way in which life happens and our pace as a startup, that it's not the public sector. And you have investors and you have like that kind of pressure of like creating something, but at the same time working really close with communities that have our pace. So I'm trying to figure this out from my perspective. So I agree how difficult it is, and I think that we should start just accepting that the pace is different, and all the actors that work with those communities, those neighborhoods, those spaces start accepting it and having sharing the same language and reality. So that's what I'm trying to do from my side.
All right. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. And